Okay, we are in Masechet Arachin, and now we're starting a series of sugyot. Arachin, the main agadata, as we said last week, is about Lashon Hara. There's two dapim of all sorts of agadatot about Lashon Hara. So hopefully we'll be spending several weeks going through various discussions about that. And this week what we're going to be talking about is the Miraglim. The episode of the Miraglim that they said Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael. And we'll see first a few different midrashim that have variations of the same idea, but then really discuss the specific drasha of the Gemara and try to understand what it's really trying to say, because at first glance it doesn't make that much sense. It will get a little bit technical as we get into the Mefarshim. There'll be some dikduk, which is not usually what we talk about, but in the end we'll see all the different opinions and how they stack up against each other, and kind of the different malachim, the different kind of approaches that the Mefarshim have. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves of the specific episode that the Gemara will be discussing. So the story of the Miraglim is obviously, it's told in Sefer Bamidbar, from a third-person perspective from the Torah, and then it's also told in Sefer Dorei. Moshe is recounting the story of the Miraglim. So we'll just remind ourselves of the psukim. Okay, so the first source, ויספרו לו ויאמרו באנו אל הארץ אשר שלחתנו וגם זבת חלב ודבש הוא וזה פריה אפס כי אז העם יושב בארץ והערים בצורות גדולות מאוד וגם לידי הענק ראינו שם. Okay, so they come and they say the cities are massive, and we saw giants there. עמלק יושב בארץ הנגב, החיתי והיבוסי והאמורי יושב בהר והכנעני יושב על הים ועל ארץ הירדן ועל יד הירדן. Okay, so the Meraglim come, they talk about how the nations are all there and they're so big. ויעש כלב את העם אל משה ויאמר הלא נעלה וירשנו אותה כי יכול נוכל בה. So Kalev comes, silences them, and says, no, we can do it. ואנשים אשר עלו עמו אמרו לא נוכל לעלות אל העם כי חזק הוא ממנו. Okay, we cannot go in to the nation because they are stronger than us. Okay, recounted also in Dvarim, Perek Aleph. Moshe is telling the first person accounting, ויקחו בידם מפרי הארץ וירדו אלינו וישבו איתנו דבר ויאמרו טובה הארץ אשר השם אלוקינו נתן לנו ולא הביאתם לעלות. ותמרו את פי השם אלוקיכם. So right, there's subtle differences between the way the story is told by Moshe and the way the Torah tells us. We're not going to go into the differences and why they might be. So the people come and they murmur in their tents and they say it's because Hashem chas v'shalom hates us that He took us out of Mitzrayim. Ana אנחנו עולים אחינו ומסו את לבבינו לאמור עם גדול ורם ממנו ערים גדולות ובצורות בשמיים וגם בני ענקים ראינו שם. Okay, so the people are complaining. They're saying this nation is Am Gadol V'Ram Mimenu. Okay? The Gemara in Arachin on Daf Tedvav Amud Aleph says as follows: Tanya, Amar Rabbi Elazar ben Parta, Bo Kama Gadol Koch Shel Lashon Hara. Come see how powerful Lashon Hara is. Minalan, from where Miraglim. Uma Motzi Shem Ra Leitzim V'Avanim, Kacha Motzi Shem Ra L'Chavero Achad Kama V'Chama. If people who were Motzi Shem Ra, who said Lashon Hara about stones and trees, were punished so severely, as we know the Meraglim were punished very severely, so those who say Lashon Hara about another person, how much more so should they fear the punishment of Lashon Hara? Mimai, but why do we conclude this? Gemara asks. Dilma mishum de Rabbi Chanina bar Papa. Maybe it's as Rabbi Chanina bar Papa says. Dama Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, davar gadol dibru Meraglim b'ota sha'a. When the Meraglim spoke, they said a great blasphemy. Because dichtiv, it says ki chazak hu mimenu, right? That they said that the nations are too strong for us. Ki chazak hu mimenu. Al tikre mimenu, al tikre ki chazak hu mimenu, ela mimenu. Don't read mimenu, rather read mimenu. Ki v'yachol ba'al habayit eno yachol leotzi kelav misham. In other words, don't read it as they are strong, that we can't go into Eretz Yisrael because the nations there are too strong for us, mimenu. Rather read it ki chazak hu mimenu, from him being HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So they're not saying Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael, they're saying Lashon Hara about Hashem. They're saying ki v'yachol ba'al habayit eno yachol leotzi kelav misham. It's as if the master of the house cannot remove his things from the house. Hashem can't ki v'yachol remove the nations from Eretz Yisrael. That's why it was such a severe sin what they did to the Meraglim. They weren't just saying something about Eretz Yisrael, they were saying something about Hashem being unable to remove the nations. They were too strong for Him. Okay? Amar Rabba, Amar Reish Lakish, Amar Kra, it says, Vayemutu anashim, motzi'ei dibat ha'aretz ra'al, dibat ha'aretz shotzi'u. Okay, so there's the reason, so what's the flow of the Gemara here? That maybe the reason why remember Rabbi Elazar ben Parta had a drasha to say, if the Meraglim, they only said Lashon Hara about trees and stones, so you can derive that someone said Lashon Hara about another person, how terrible it is. But if we understand, like Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, they didn't say about trees and stones. It's not a kal v'chomer, because I said it about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There's no kal v'chomer from that Lashon Hara. So we have to answer that and say, rather, Ela Amar Rava Amar Reish Lakish, Amar Kra, the pasuk in Bamidrash says, Vayamutu anashim, they died, Motzi'ei dibat haaretz, Ra'ah. Okay, the ones who spoke poorly about the land, Al dibat haaretz shotziu. So there we have an explicit pasuk saying that they spoke about the land. So even if I accept Rabbi Chanina bar Papa's drasha, there's still a source to say they also spoke about the land itself. Okay? We have a similar teaching in Menachot and Daf Nun Gimel Amud Bet. It just also brings an additional proof from Pasuk in Yirmiyahu. It says there, "Kol ha'amula gdola hitzita esh alea v'ra'u diliotav." Okay, so from the great voice, the strong voice, a fire went out and it broke the branches. Amar Rabbi Chanina bar Papa, lekol milehen shel meraglin nitra'u diliotehen shel Yisrael. So it explains this pasuk to mean, from the great noise of the meraglim, the branches of Israel were broken. Damar b'china bar Papa, davar gadol dibur meraglim ota she'a, ki chazak hu mimeno, tikam mimeno el mimenu, ki v'echol shafilu ba'al habayit yinechol otzik elav misham. So it just finds a source for this idea in Yirmiyahu. And another midrash which teaches the same idea, miyad alchu ve'amu ki chazak hu mimenu, the meraglim said ki chazak hu mimenu, tanchuma, Amar Reish Lakish. So here it's brought in the name of Reish Lakish instead of Rabbi Chanina bar Papa. Ikishan klapei malan. They said something difficult against the one who was high up. And it's because of that Lashon Hara against Hashem that they were punished so severely. You don't realize what you even said. You don't realize how serious what you said is. From the voice that you emitted from your mouth, what have you caused for yourself? A fire, a metaphorical fire, has broken out. That you will now have to spend 40 years wandering the desert, 1 year for every day that you sinned. Okay, so these are all different versions of the same midrash, but the basic idea stands. Very good. The question that we're going to be discussing is actually right before we get to the main question of the shiur. Let's look at the Eitz Yosef. It's on the sheet actually. So where the Eitz Yosef, you see on the second line on the left side, it says Ba'al Habayit HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so the Eitz Yosef just notes something interesting. She says, She'amru ki chazak hu mimenu. Mimenu means min HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'dayek she'amru ken, and it's precise here. She'ilu musav mimenu al Yisrael, because if the word mimenu is applying to Yisrael and not to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, en raya me'asherim chazakim mehem. What's the proof then that they're stronger than them? Sheri paro ve'amalek hayu gam ken chazakim mehem mikol makom naflu biyadam. In other words, the Eitz Yosef is saying the source of this drasha is if they said, oh, the nations are greater than us, why was that something that is a deterrent? Because also Mitzrayim was greater than them, and also Amalek was greater than them, but they still managed to defeat them with Hashem's help. So why would them coming and saying, oh, now we've come to Canaan, we have all these nations that are greater than us, but they've already defeated nations that were greater than them. So that's why it's coming to understand that they had a different intent when they said, Ki chazaku mimenu. Shekadosh Baruch Hu pil miyadam. Elohim ken she'amru she'em chazakim min HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right? Ve'bet yaminu ki hema amru arim gdulot u'betzurot me'od. Okay, and here he just has this nice drasha where he says, if we look in Bamidbar, they said that the cities, Arim B'tzurot Gdolot Me'od, the cities were very, very big and fortified. U'befarshat Dvarim, but when Moshe recounts it, Amar Moshe Shemeraglim Amru Arim Gdolot B'tzurot B'Shamayim. So instead of saying that the cities were very big, it said that the cities were in the heavens. Okay? So Pshat is the same idea, right? That saying they're in the heavens, Moshe is just saying that the Meraglim were reporting that they were so tall that they went up to the heavens. But the Eitz Yosef is deriving from this a lesson. Ela sheMoshe hevin midivrehem kfira gdola ba'Kadosh Baruch Hu. It's saying Moshe, when he says that, when he's recounting what the Meraglim said, he says the Meraglim, they said 40 years ago that the cities went up to Shemayim. He's saying that's what they really meant when they said that the cities were very big, because they were really doing kfirah against Shamayim, against the HaKadosh Baruch Hu. כי אמרו כי חזק הוא ממנו, כביכול אפילו בעל הבית אינו יכול להוציא כליו משם. ואמרו שחוזק זה בא להם מכוכבי השמיים וכסיליהם. וזה שאמרו בצורות בשמיים, שמזלם בשמיים חזק ממנו כביכול. Okay, that's interesting. תראה לא אמרו כפירה הזו בפירוש. It says in the beginning, they didn't say this כפירה explicitly, right? They said, הערים בצורות מאוד, גדולות מאוד. אמרו סתם בצורות גדולות מאוד. וכאשר בא כלב והחיש אותם, right? And then Kalev came and said, no, it's not true, we can defeat them. Then, what happens? אמרו הכפירה בפירוש כי חזק הוא ממנו. So the flow in Bamidbar is they say, הערים בצורות גדולות מאוד, the cities are very big, but they don't explicitly say that it's too great for Hashem. And then Kalev comes and says, oh, we can defeat them, and they come and they say, we can't defeat them because ki chazak hu mimenu, meaning from Hashem. And Moshe, by saying Bashamayim, understood that even that was their original intent, that they were even originally they just didn't say it beferush, but they originally even meant to go against the Kadosh Baruch Hu. From what they said in the end, you understood what they originally meant in the beginning. Right? That the drasha here is, I can understand from Moshe's rereading them saying me'od as being bashamayim, he's hinting to the fact that they are always meant ki chazak hu mimenu kivyachol ba'al habayit. That's just this sharp reading of the Eitz Yosef to kind of reconcile the two accounts. Okay, on to our main topic. Is anyone bothered by al tikrei mimenu ala mimenu? So, what does that mean? Usually when you have this idea of al tikrei something, ala something, there's a difference, right? Usually you'll say al tikrei and you'll switch a letter or you'll switch something about the word. But saying al tikrei mimenu ala mimenu, you're not switching it at all. And the anomaly here is that the word mimenu is used both to refer to the third person plural and the first person singular. Meaning, if I want to say lakachti et ze mimenu, that could mean either I took it from him, like him being from him, or I can say lakach et ze mimenu, that he took it from us. Correct me if I'm wrong, Kobe. Is that correct grammatically?
Mimena is from her.
Mimena is from her. Mimenu is either from him or from us, as a group in the first person.
He's making a mistake in saying Mimeno instead of
Mimeno.
It should be Mimenu for both.
So Mimenu is both first person plural and third person singular, and that's the source of the drasha. In other words, instead of saying it's stronger than us in the first person, it's saying it's stronger than him in the third person, talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the drasha is the exact same drasha. So why say al tikrei mimenu? So if you look at Rashi on page 2, so Rashi actually says lo garas. So Rashi deletes the phrase al tikrei mimenu al mimenu. She'en hefresh kriya ben mimenu hane'emar yachid shenidabarim alav le'mimenu sherabim shomrim al atzmam. Rashi says there's no difference. It's the exact same word, which is what we just said. There's no, and he says here in Hebrew what we just said, which is third person singular and first person plural, right? Yachid shenidabarim alav, first person. Le'mimenu sherabim shomrim al atzmam. That both of those are the exact same word in Hebrew, and therefore al tikrei mimenu, you delete that. You just have the drasha. You say it says mimenu. Instead of understanding pshat to mean they're referring to themselves, you understand the pshat to mean they're referring to Hashem. So that's Rashi. Okay, good. Now, if we go back to the sheet over here, there's a few of the Mefarshim who raise interesting points here. So the Anaf Yosef, which is on the right side, he says as follows. If you look from the third line from the bottom, on the last word on the line of the Anaf Yosef, he says lachen. Okay, so he says lachen. Pirshu kipshuto, al tikra mimenu ela mimenu. And it's you can't really see it because the screenshot is blurry. But the mimenu and the mimenu in his text here, it's not the same. The nikud is different. That the first one says mimenu, and the second one actually says mimeno, with the dot on top of the vav. If it were clear, we'd be able to see. You can actually kind of see the little dot on top of the second vav, but it's in the original sefer there. I took the picture from it. It's very clear. Lefi she'amru ken HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So what does that mean? Ve'af shelo tishtedena b'michtavan. So even though the letters are exactly the same, mem nun vav, rak b'tnuat ha'cholam v'shilruk lifamim yitachen lomar lehem al tikrei. So what does the Anaf Yosef say? He says, so the letters are exactly the same. And, okay, the vav at the end, even though it's mimenu and mimeno. So, and you can still say, you can still use the al tikre x loy in that situation because you have a different vowel. Okay, so even though the letters are the same, he says you can still say al tikre mimenu el mimeno. Wait, but didn't we just see in Rashi that they're both mimenu? So what's the Anaf Yosef talking about that al tikre mimenu el mimeno? He's saying it's not that there's no difference. There is a difference. It's just the difference is in the vowel at the end. That the third person, the first person plural is mimenu, but the third person singular is mimeno. So he says that's why you have al tikre x y. So that seems to contradict Rashi. It gets even more strange if we look at the Yun Yaakov, which is the commentary on top there, where on the last line on the right side it says al tikre ki chazak hu mimenu. Okay, so he says ayin b'Rashi. See what Rashi says kan. V'hu soter lema shekatav Rashi b'sota perak el ne'emarin. So see what Rashi says here, and Rashi contradicts himself compared to what he says in Sotah, where this same drasha is brought. V'yoter nir'eh al tikre mimenu b'malafum, okay, tachat hanun vav tekayel Yisrael ela krinan mimenu b'cholam ala nun vav tekayel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, so he says really what it should be is don't read it with a malafum. Now, what is a malafum? We'll talk about that in a second, because I've never heard of a malafum before. He says don't read it with the vowelization malafum underneath the nun vav, in which case it would refer to Yisrael. Instead, read it with a cholam on the nun vav, which would refer to Kadosh Baruch Hu. In other words, he's saying the same thing as the Anaf Yosef, that don't read it with a malafum under the nun vav, but instead of mimenu with the dot in the vav, it's mimenu with the three dots under the, right? You know, you have the three dots diagonally, and that also makes the sound u. So he says here, tachat nun vav, and he's calling that malafum, which we call in modern Hebrew, of course, shuruk. Right, a shuruk is three diagonal dots.
No, it's kubutz.
Kubutz, excuse me, thank you. Kubutz, thank you, sorry. Kubutz is three dots. Shuruk is the vav with the dot. So he's saying here, instead of it being read mimenu, but instead of the vav with the dot, he says the three dots, even though they sound the same, he says read it with the cholam, which is cholam is with the dot on top, which is mimenu. Okay? So the Yun Yaakov says that Yoter Nireh, he seems to agree with Anaf Yosef. But what's bizarre is he says Rashi contradicts himself. And what's weird is if we look, we quoted Rashi before from Sota. He says Rashi here in Arachin contradicts himself in Sota. But there is no Rashi in Arachin. If you look, Rashi doesn't say anything in Arachin, he just says something in Sota. So, first of all, the Yun Yaakov says Rashi contradicts himself, and he doesn't seem to do that. But then he disagrees with Rashi Bichlal and says more similar to the Anaf Yosef. So, let's try to understand what's going on here.
There's no Rashi at all in Arachin?
There's no Rashi in all in Arachin. He doesn't comment on this at all. If you open up the Gemara, he doesn't comment on it. We'll see. I'll do a bit of a spoiler alert. One of the Achronim, to try to understand this, Yun Yaakov says that the Yun Yaakov is a commentary on the Ein Yaakov. The Ein Yaakov is a compilation of just the Agadot. And the Ein Yaakov, as printed, quotes Rashi from Sota in the Gemara on Arachin. So even though Rashi doesn't comment in the Gemara on Arachin, because it's the exact same sugya, it brings Rashi from Sota and quotes him here in the Ein Yaakov. So this other Achron, the Chidushei Geonim, says Yun Yaakov probably got mixed up. He was learning the Ein Yaakov. He saw Rashi quoted, and he didn't realize that the quote of Rashi here was the printer quoting him from Sota and printing it here in Arachin, and he thought Rashi actually commented in Arachin. So that's the explanation of the Chidushei Geonim and why the Yun Yaakov says Rashi contradicts himself, because in our printed version of Arachin, Rashi doesn't say anything. But, be that as may, what is this melafum, and where are they getting this idea that mimenu and mimeno, right? We just established that there's no difference, and Rashi told us there's no difference. So, to understand that, we can look at the next source, going back to here, on page 2. So, Rashi has a comment in a different context, where when Bnei Yisrael are leaving Mitzrayim, so they say, Kitovlanu b'Mitzrayim mimutenu b'midbar. Right? It would have been better for us to stay in Egypt than to die in the desert. And he uses this word, mimutenu. And mimutenu is similar to mimenu in the grammatical sense. So Rashi says, mimutenu means ma'asher namut, for us to die. It's talking about a first person plural, that we should not die in the desert. And Rashi says, v'imaya nakud malafom, hayana ve'er מיתתנו. עכשיו שנקוד בשורוק, נבאר מאשר למות. וכן, כי מי ייתן מותנו שימות. The Rashi says, if I had this malafum, then I would know it meant not from our death, but from something else, like from his death. But now that it's written with a shuruk, I know what it means from our death. So Rashi here is acknowledging it's mimutenu. He calls it a shuruk, which is the vav with the da in it. That's fine. But he says if it had been written mimuteno, and here he refers to mimuteno as a malafum. Okay? That's what we call a cholam. Basically, the cholam is the vav with the dot on top. We'll look at the Gur Aryeh and then we'll see a summary. I made a summary table because it's very confusing with all the different nikud.
I'm sure what it means, because it says it's the same thing. From our death. So I don't get the difference between mitatenu and מאשר נמות.
כי טבענו במצרים, מאשר נמות במדבר. What's the difference between מאשר נמות and ממיתתנו?
Yeah. Where is the malafum supposed to be? The vav?
So the malafum is the vav. Do you say mimuteno or mimutenu? So he says if it's malafum, which is like a cholam, mimuteno, it would mean mimitatenu. But we know that it's actually mimutenu, which is with a shuruk. That's what Rashi says.
Maybe he's talking about the name is mimotenu, והמיטה שלנו מימותנו. אז זה באמת הבדל מאשר למות.
On the mem instead of the vav?
Yeah, because there's no word mimutenu. It can be mimotenu and either mimutenu. That's the only thing that makes sense to me.
Well, I think the shuruk here is on the vav. You don't have a shuruk.
No, because that's not a so I don't know. No, you're right, so I don't know. Unless he called kibbutz shuruk also.
Right, so we'll get to my understanding of the differences. Gur Aryeh tries to explain Rashi here, so maybe that'll help us understand. He says as follows. Gur Aryeh lived a few hundred years after Rashi, right? So Rashi koreh b'chol perusho, ma she'ashkenazim korim cholam, koreh otam malafum. So Gur Aryeh claims what we call cholam, Ashkenazim call cholam, which is a vav with a dot on top. It goes o. So Rashi calls it malafum. That's how he referred to this particular nikud. Uma she'ashkenazim korim malafum, and what we today call malafum, shu nikuda betoch havav. So he says today we call malafum koreh Rashi b'chol perusho shuruk. Right? Now what's interesting is that we don't call anything malafum today. Right? We call what he says the Ashkenazim call malafum, Rashi calls shuruk. We agree with Rashi. We call that a shuruk. He says what Rashi calls malafum, we call cholam. So we never call the malafum. We agree with Rashi where Rashi doesn't use malafum. We agree with Ashkenazim where the Ashkenazim don't use malafum. At least that's how I understand this. Umashi Ashkenazim korim shuruk, shu gimel likudot ze al ze. So when Ashkenazim use shuruk, it's 3 dots, one next to the other. Koreato gam ken shuruk. It's also called a shuruk. וזה נכון בוודאי, כי עניין אחד הוא משפט אחד לנקודה שהוא בתוך הוו ולגימל נקודות. So Gur Aryeh says whether I have 3 dots diagonally or whether I have a vav with a dot inside, it's exactly the same. Right? We know that the sound of the vav with the dot in it is the same as the vav is without a vav but with 3 dots underneath. ולכן שניהם קורא אותו shuruk. So he says the Ashkenazim call both of them a shuruk. They don't have kubutz. They don't even have that term. They call both shuruk. It's no difference. And he says, and it's proper to call a cholam malafum. And it makes sense to call u shuruk and malafum for the om. Why? Why is it called shuruk? Because when I go u, I have to make like an o with my mouth, right? Shuruk. And it's as though I'm going to whistle. And lishrok is to whistle. So that's why it's called shuruk, because the face I have to make that noise, it reminds one of a whistle. So if I say malafom, cholam, or, so then my mouth is filled with that note. So that's malefum, it's my mouth is full. So that's the Gur Aryeh explanation for the names. So if we try to summarize the different shitot of the nikud here, based on how everybody refers to it, based on my understanding. So first of all, I have in the top there, the mo, mu, and mu, right? Mo, with the vav with the dot on top, mu with the vav and the dot in the middle, and then mu with the 3 dots underneath. So in modern Hebrew, the first one is cholam, right? Mo is cholam. Mu, the vav with the dot in it is a shuruk, and mu with the 3 dots is kubutz. Okay? What we can say is that Rashi calls our cholam malafum, Rashi calls our shuruk also shuruk, but he also calls the kubutz a shuruk, versus the Ashkenazim, according to Gur Aryeh, where they call it cholam, like we call cholam, but they call the shuruk malafum. In other words, we have a machloket with Rashi on the shuruk, and we machloket with the Ashkenazim on the cholam. Then, if we went to the Anaf Yosef and the Yun Yaakov, so based on how they refer to the Nikudot, so the Anaf Yosef called it cholam and shuruk. He actually used the terms that we use in modern Hebrew. And the Yun Yaakov called cholam, and then he also used malefum, which is, from my understanding, he was referring to the 3 dots underneath of the Yun Yaakov, which nobody else seems to call
So
it.
He doesn't hold anything about the shuruk, or he says it doesn't exist?
It just, in his comments here, he doesn't reference it. So I don't know how he would call it. That's what the lines there are. From their comments, I wasn't able to understand how they call those versions. So anyway, to me, malefum, I never heard of it before. It's this new term, but it comes up in Rashi's commentary more than once. And apparently it was a term that was used to refer to either cholam or shuruk as the names of the nikudot that developed over time. But all these opinions that we saw so far all agree that the drasha here is mimenu and mimeno. Okay? Tosfot comes and says something entirely different. He says, why is it al tikra mimenu ela mimenu? Perush al tikra mimenu rafeh ela mimenu dagesh. Okay? That there are some who say that it means, forget the mimenu mimeno, it's new, it ends in nu. But the nun, the question is, does the nun have a dagesh, or is it without a dagesh? Okay, Tosafot says, some people say that the nun should not be read without a dagesh, it should be read with a dagesh. That's the drasha, and that's the difference between the first person plural, which is going to be without a dagesh, and the first person singular, which is going to be with a dagesh. But then Tosafot rejects that and says, ve'enoken, that's not true. Shekol mimenu shebatorah gushin. Every single time mimenu appears in the Torah, it has a dagesh in the nun. Ve'eno machlif klal ze bezen. There's no difference between the third person and the first person. Both of them have a dagesh in the nun. Okay, and he brings another drasha for it. If we look at what's Tosfot talking about here, if we look at Ibn Ezra, who was a grammarian, Ibn Ezra was very big on dikduk, he says as follows. So he's commenting on a pasuk at the beginning of Sefer Shmot, where Paro is talking about somewhere in that context, he uses the word mimenu, and is talking third person. He's talking about us, Paro, that they are more. And Paro is talking about us, the Egyptians. Okay, so it's first person there. And then Ibn Ezra says, "Kol mimenu besifrei anshe mizrach siman rabim." So, for the people who live in the East, anytime it's talking about first person plural, there's no dagesh in the nun. So he says, according to the people in the East, if mimenu is referring to the first person plural, like Paro is talking about us, the Egyptians, there's no dagesh in the nun. But if it's talking about third person singular, then there is a dagesh in the nun. But then the Ibn Ezra adds, "V'chol sifrei ma'arav shnehem degushim ben shu siman lashon yachid ben shu siman lashon rabim." But in the West, there's no difference whether it's third person or first person. You have a dagesh in the nun. So in the East, they differentiate between those two forms, whether there's a dagesh or not a dagesh. But in the West, they don't. Okay. So according to the Ibn Ezra, then, when Tosfot says there's some who say Al tikra mimenu, ela mimenu, it's referring to the dagesh, that would be according to these anshe mizrach, that they differentiate. And then when Tosfot rejects that and says there's no difference, so he says, but we're in the West, and he doesn't have that tradition of any difference. Just because we're getting close to the end here, I'll just read the Minchat Shai, which is an authority on dikduk in the Torah and the Mesorah. Okay, so he says da-da-da-da-da. Let's see if so if you just skip to the second to last line here, V'yadua ki anshe mizrach hem b'nei Bavel. So he says the Anshe Mizrach that the Ibn Ezra was referring to is talking about Bavel. V'achi kamar, al tikra mimenu. So we're talking about the Talmud Bavli here. If we go back to our original drasha of Rabbi China Bar Papa, don't read it as mimenu, lashon rabim, benun rafa. Don't read it as us, first person, with the nun without the dagesh. Ela mimenu, talking about a Kadosh Baruch Hu in the third person, which has a dagesh, kivyachol. In other words, he says, right, al tikre mimenu, ela mimenu, that would work if we're saying the Anshe Mizrach are correct. Because the Anshe Mizrach say that you can read, there's a difference between one having a dagesh, one not having a dagesh, and then al tikre mimenu, ela mimenu, so even though the letters are the same, but the difference is not whether the vav is u or o, the difference is whether the nun has the dagesh or not a dagesh. So this is a third option of how to understand mimenu ela mimenu, right? First we saw Rashi says they're exactly the same, delete them. Then we saw all these various mefarshim who debate the names and this and that, but they all agreed that the difference is in the vowelization. And the third option is that, according to the Anshe Mizrach, where you have a nikuda in the nun or not in the nun, and then you can find the mimenu ela mimenu. If we just go to this last source here, we'll skip. This is a very, very long Chidushei Gonim. He goes through a lot of details, but we'll just do a very short portion of it, where on the very last column, all the way on the left, you see where it says Omnam in big letters. It's about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines down on the last column on the left. So he says Omnam lefi ze yakshe ech ka'amar Rashas lashon al tikre. So he says, and then you can answer Rashi's whole questions. How can you say al tikre mimenu ela mimenu if it's the exact same word, right? And then we saw, okay, maybe the nikud is different and explains it. Maybe the dagesh is different, and he offers a third solution. He says, "Shilfi dvarenu akriya shava lerabim." Okay, so even if the reading is exactly the same, nimtzaim medabrim ba'ida uliachid nistar v'chrach tzarich lomar. What you have to say, sheperush al tikrei kach elakach. That we're misunderstanding the idea of this concept of don't read it like this, read it like that. Eino mishamesh al ofen hishtanut hakriya el al ofen aperush. In other words, what the Chidushei Gonim says is, forget the malefum cholam, forget mimenu, forget even Anshe Mizrach of Tosfot and the Ibn Ezra, that it's a rafa and that there's dagesh and dagesh. Say no, like Rashi said, al tikra mimenu, and the third person singular and the first person plural are written exactly the same. He says I can still use this methodology of this midrashic tool of al tikra mimenu ela mimenu, even if the word is exactly the same, pronounced and spelled exactly the same with nikud, with dagesh, because I'm changing the meaning of the word. I'm saying don't read it mimenu as a reference to us, the meraglim, read it mimenu as a reference to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it just happens in this particular case that there's no technical difference in the vowelization of the dagesh, but the drasha of like the way that I do a midrash like this, usually I change a hey to a chet or a reish to a dalet. In this case, I don't change anything, but I'm still using the same form to teach a lesson of lashon hara was really kfira gdola she'asu sham kivyachol ba'al habayit ein yachol latzik eli misham, and I can still use that framing even if the word is exactly the same in both cases in this particular situation. So those are like three different approaches how to understand this drasha of Rabbi Chalina Bar Papa as expanded upon by the Mefarshim. Shkoyach.